Hello and welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of the Into Wonder podcast. My name is Antonio Norvell, and I'm very excited to kick off this podcast with the guest today. Um, Before I start, I just want to say I am quite nervous, and I apologize if my frontal lobe malfunctions here and there. Um, just give me a break. Um, Without further ado, I would love to present our guest today. His name is Dr. Jay Garfield. Jay is a philosopher. He specializes in Buddhist philosophy. He holds multifarious professorships at varying universities, including the University of Melbourne, Smith College, Harvard Divinity, as well as a university in Tibet. Jay has written many, many works. He has also done translations from Tibet into English. Um, And for myself personally, Jay's work has been very exciting, and it's helped me understand a lot of these um, Eastern ideas, a lot of these really weird Eastern ideas um, in Buddhism, such as the self and emptiness. And I was really struggling with these ideas, and I was very fortunate to stumble upon Jay's work and help give me a better understanding of what the heck was going on in these discussions. Um, and so I'm very excited to have this conversation. Again, I'm a huge fan of Jay's work. I've been following it quite closely these past 2 years, and it's helped my understanding a lot in understanding myself better, in understanding just overall my place in the universe, and trying to understand this whole strange thing that is life. Um, so without further ado, Jay, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Antonio. It's a real honor to be your guest on this wonderful podcast and look forward to our conversation.
I kind of want to start in understanding where your interest in Buddhist philosophy in particular starts, because it's what I understand so far is that you had a student that came to you with a thesis they were writing on Tibetan epistemology. And I'm curious, what was it in particular that stood out to you at first? Because you have such a strong foundation in Western philosophy. What was it in particular that really made you go like, there's something interesting here that is worth considering and should be in the conversation?
Yeah, well, that's kind of a longish story, um, and sometimes a somewhat embarrassing one. If your listeners want
No shame.
all the gory details, they can kind of read my online autobiography called "Practicing Without a License." But basically, the story goes like this. I did my PhD, as you point out, in strictly Western philosophical areas, foundations of cognitive science and logic. I still work in those areas, and I've never given any of that up. I just added other things. My first teaching job was at a college that's about to go out of business called Hampshire College, which was a very non-traditional, innovative college in Massachusetts. And so when I showed up at Hampshire after having done this PhD in logic and cognitive science, the very first student who walked into my very first office was a guy named David. He was very tall, had really long hair and long beard, and daishiki and beads. This was Hampshire,
I love it.
1980. Bare feet.
Oh, I love
Came
it.
in.
Yeah.
And, yeah, it was just perfect. For those of us who grew up in the 60s, it was. I always
Yeah.
said that Hampshire was a little shard of 1968 that lasted longer than the rest of that year. Um, and he said, my name's David stuff, and I'd like you to to serve on my committee for my senior thesis. It's on, connections between medieval Tibetan epistemology and the social contract tradition. And I burst out laughing. I thought somebody had paid him $5 to give me a welcome to Hampshire joke. Um, and he was kind of shocked because he had this really interesting project he thought that involved this relationship between these very different traditions. He'd been spending a lot of time studying Tibetan, so he could read the relevant Tibetan texts. And here was this brand new assistant professor laughing in his face. We kind of got past that. And At that time, Bob Thurman, who was a dear friend of mine now for many years, who passed away last week, was teaching at Amherst College, the same consortium, right up the road. And David said, "Listen, man, Thurman up the road in Amherst, he's going to do the Tibetan stuff with me. I just want you to keep me honest on Locke and Rousseau. You can read Locke and Rousseau, can't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I can read Locke and Rousseau." And I thought it would be a really bad start to my career to turn down the first student who asked me to work with him. So I said, "Sure." I'm having no idea what I was getting myself in for. And it turned out the Tibetan material that he was working from was one of the most complicated, difficult treatises on hermeneutics in the Tibetan tradition by a guy named Tsongkhapa, the 14th, 15th century philosopher. Tibetan, it's called Tangye Lekshe Ningbo. It means really the essence of hermeneutics. And it's an extremely technical text on how, from a Madhyamaka perspective, you could read Yogacara Sutras, and presupposes a lot of background in Buddhist philosophy, and also written in this very technical Tibetan philosophical prose. And what I was reading were the rough drafts of Bob Thurman's translation of this text, which was the first serious Tibetan scholastic text anybody tried to translate into English. Mm-hmm. So even when it came out, it was hard to read, but the rough drafts were really hard to read. So I was reading rough drafts of this extremely technical text that presupposed that whoever read it knew a shitload of Buddhist philosophy. And I was mystified most of the time. I had no idea what was going on. But it was interesting. I learned some stuff. David finished his thesis. It was good. He became a famous law professor. I put it all down because I had a career to get going in cognitive science and logic. So I wasn't going to waste any more time on this medieval Tibetan epistemology. But 7 years later, there was a big battle at Hampshire in the faculty. And I was on the losing side. And I'm really glad my side lost. I'm kind of embarrassed by the position that I defended. But I was young and stupid, as many of us once were. And the debate was over a new curricular requirement at Hampshire. And it was called, in the college's language, the third world expectation, but that's just flowery political language. What it really meant was a strong multicultural requirement that was attached to a student's concentration, which is Hampshireese for major. So it means that whatever you're studying, you have to study the way it's pursued in some non-Western culture, or its impact on some non-Western culture. You can't just do the white studies version of your subject. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that's true whether you're doing art history or mathematics or philosophy or physics or chemistry or ecology, no matter what it is, you can't just look at the way that white people have done it and what it means to white people. I opposed it, along with just under half of the faculty, on the grounds that it would represent an abridgment of academic freedom, both students' freedom to design their own courses of study, but also for faculty, because you can't teach stuff that you don't work on. And it would force us to work on stuff that we weren't necessarily trained to do and we weren't interested in doing. Mm-hmm. But it passed, and I was right. The college turned around to the faculty and said, "Okay, we've got this new requirement. We can't require students to study what we don't teach." So basically, everybody who doesn't already have a competence in a non-Western area of their subject has a choice: retool or resign. I wasn't about to resign because job market in philosophy was pretty bad, and I was pretty happy where I was. Mm-hmm. So I said, "Shit, what am I going to do in non-Western philosophy? I don't know anything about that." But then I thought, medieval Tibetan epistemology, that stuff I did 7 years ago. I could probably learn enough of that to do a week in my epistemology class, and I will have paid my debt to the third world expectation. So I applied for a small grant to basically hire Bob Thurman to teach me some Tibetan epistemology over the summer, so that I could incorporate it in my class. And I did that. And it was really fun. For one thing, it really began, I would say, not began, but really cemented a long-term friendship with Bob, built around work in Buddhist philosophy that was very important in my life. Mm-hmm. But it also got me this leverage into this material that allowed me to do a week in that class, and students loved it. So the next year, I applied for a bigger grant to hire Bob to teach enough epistemology to do this big comparative skepticism class. And that was really fabulous. But by this time, I was encountering this problem. And the problem was, I'd be reading these texts and they would be citing other texts all over the place. So, I'd call Bob up and I'd say, hey, Bob, I'm reading this text and it says that this passage comes in this text called Buddha Polita. Do you have a copy of that? And Bob said, sure, I do, Jay, but it's only available in Tibetan. I said, damn. Hey, Bob, this text is citing Pramanavartika. Do you have a copy of that? Yeah, Jay, but it's only available in Tibetan. So I realized I had to learn Tibetan if I was going to get anywhere with this stuff. And fortunately, there was this guy at Amherst College, student, who was taking some of my classes, who also wanted to learn Tibetan. And so we decided, well, there's this Dharma center in town with this guy in Tibetan robes. Let's ask him if he'll teach us some Tibetan. So we went and knocked on his door. And he came out and we tried to explain what we wanted. It was clear he spoke almost no English at all. Like 50, 100 words, but we got through what we wanted to, we got over to him what we wanted to do, and he agreed to do that. But also simultaneously with this, a whole lot of things were coming together, as they sometimes do fortuitously. I'd got this call out of the blue from a Tibetan graduate student at UMass, also in the same 5-college consortium that I was, who had read my book, Belief in Psychology, which was my first big book in Foundations of Cognitive Science. And he called and said, I just read your book and you must have been studying Buddhist philosophy. And of course I hadn't when I wrote that book. And I said, I don't quite see why you think that. And he explained what he saw there. And I said, yeah, that's similar, but it didn't come from there. It came from other places. But his kids and my kids were the same age and they got to be really good friends. And so our families got to be really good friends. So I met this guy. This is like in the background of all of this. But I started, thinking at some point I'm going to have to really get serious about Tibetan. So I was studying Tibetan. And then this, and I should tell you a little bit about how we started learning Tibetan. Because nowadays, if you want to learn Tibetan, it's really easy, right? There's great online courses, there's textbooks, there's Tibetan grammars. I mean, you could learn Tibetan like you could learn French or German. Back then, there was nothing. There were no materials for teaching Tibetan, classical Tibetan or spoken Tibetan. So you basically were just finding somebody who could do something. And so the way he was teaching us Tibetan was he had us buy a Tibetan English dictionary, which was actually a classical Tibetan dictionary, not a modern Tibetan dictionary. And what we were supposed to do is every week, we would have to choose 10 words of our choosing at first. Then it got to be 20, then 30, then 40 as we went further. And we were supposed to choose these words and learn what they meant, and then write sentences using them in Tibetan. We'd learn the alphabet first. And then we would take these sentences to him. And we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't know any Tibetan grammar or anything, right? And he would look at them and he'd shake his head very sadly. And then he would rewrite them. And then he would say it your way. And we'd say what we had written. Then he'd say it my way. We'd say it. He said, sounds nicer, yes? And so we were trying to learn Tibetan grammar by what sounded nicer to Geshe-la. So for like 2 years.
Wow.
So keep that one in the background for a minute. Anyway, the National Endowment for Humanities advertised a summer institute on Nagarjuna, this very important Madhyamaka philosopher, whose work I was really interested in. And it was at Hawaii, University of Hawaii, for 6 weeks. And I thought, wow, this is so cool. Like, I'll never get in. But wouldn't it be cool if I did 6 weeks in Hawaii studying Nagarjuna with people who actually know about this shit and aren't making it up, right? So I applied and I got in, to my astonishment. So I went off to Hawaii and I met some really interesting people who were really into Nagarjuna. The most important of those people for me was Guy Newland. He's a really eminent scholar of Buddhist philosophy and a really great Tibetanist. And he taught me a lot of Madhyamaka there, and also taught me about this really big commentary called Ocean of Reasoning, written by Tsongkhapa. He said, that's the great commentary to read, but of course, if you don't read Tibetan, you can't get near it. I said, I'm learning. So at this point, I was starting to ask people the following question. If you're interested in Buddhist philosophy Indo-Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, and you really want to learn some Tibetan and some Tibetan philosophy, where do you go? And everybody was telling me the same thing. You go to Sarnath in India, to the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. And that's where you can really get your training. And if you're lucky, the person you want to study with is this great scholar named Geshe-Geshe Topka. Back then, there was a great grant program called the Indo-American Fellowship, which was only available to people who had never been to India before, had not studied anything South Asian, but were interested in getting a competence in something South Asian. That was me. Again, I didn't think we'd get it, but we applied for it, and damn, we got it. My friend Nawang, who now comes back to us, but Tibetan graduate student at UMass, then tells me, hey, I'm an alumnus of that institute. And I studied with Geshe-Geshe Topka, and I know the vice chancellor there. I can write you some letters of introduction. So I had letters of introduction from this friend who I'd met because he'd read my book and our kids liked each other. Bob Thurman was willing to give me some letters of introduction too. And so we packed up the family and we went off to Sarnath. Now, this was in 1990. So this is a long time ago. And India was not the big powerhouse in tech that it is now. It wasn't a developed country like it was now. It was a very poor country and a very underdeveloped country. So to give you some ideas, the village that we were in where this institute was didn't have any telephone lines. If we wanted to make a telephone call, we had to go into Varanasi, which was 10 kilometers away, through the jungle, and line up at the telephone and telegraph office to use the telephone line that was international. Right?
Yeah.
The electricity was only available 2 hours a day, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening. That's when you turned your water pump on and got some water, turned the lights on, did things, charged your batteries, whatever you needed to do. I took the first computer onto the campus of the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. Big old laptop thing that, was pretty clunky, but that's what we used in 1990. Yeah. Anyway, so it was like that. It was very difficult. And we were in a very traditional, very kind of backward part of India. We were going with we went with my wife and me and our two kids who were 6 and 10 off to India for a year to live in this place. So Nawang had told us, tell me when you get bored with the story. I mean, it's such a crazy
No, I love
story.
it. There's so much. I'm trying to follow, and I love it.
This is how I got into this. So Nawang had told me that while you're looking for a place to live, a really good place to stay in Sarnath is at the Chinese temple. So we didn't know what Chinese temple would be like or anything, but after we got to Varanasi, we put our stuff on top of a taxi and told them to take us to the Chinese temple in Sarnath. We get there, it's a very quiet, beautiful temple. And yes, they had a room for us. It was a room up on the second floor. So we sort of unloaded again. It was me, my wife, my 6 and 10-year-old. None of us spoke any Hindi, which is the language that's spoken there. And we'll get to my Tibetan in a minute. But the second night that we were there, I became very seriously ill. I don't remember the next 2 days because I was basically unconscious for 2 days with an extremely high fever in this room in a temple in this tiny little village with no electricity where none of us spoke the language in a country that we'd only been in for 2 days, right? Like imagine being my kids or my wife at this point. It was easy for me because I was unconscious. But they were pretty panicked. They were pretty panicked. But after 2 days, apparently, I opened my eyes and my wife said, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Are you there? And I sort of said, yeah, but I just got this horrible headache. And I looked and I said, who's this? Because there was this elderly monk sitting next to the bed. And she said, I don't know, but he's been here for 2 days without a break, just sponging you down with cold water until now. And I don't know who he is. And that was Geshe-Geshe Topka, who was the person I had come to study with, who lived in the Chinese temple, and had simply heard there was a foreigner who was sick, had no idea who I was, no idea who our family was, and came up and spent 2 days keeping me from dying, basically. And there's a whole genre of Tibetan stories called How I Met My Teacher. That's how I met my teacher. We spent the next year working with Geshe-Geshe Topka there, and studying Tibetan and studying Nagarjuna and Madhyamaka and kind of never looked back. But the
Mhm.
punchline to this whole story was when I went onto campus and started speaking what I thought was Tibetan, people doubled over laughing, and they'd call their friends and said, come on, wait, say that again, right? Because here's what we didn't know, what John and I didn't know about that monk we hired to teach us Tibetan. He wasn't Tibetan after all. He was Ladakhi. And Ladakhi is roughly to standard spoken Tibetan as a kind of West Virginia hillbilly English is to BBC English. And so I was using all these pronunciations and slang words that people just thought were absolutely hilarious. Listening to this professor thinking he was speaking proper Tibetan when he was speaking like a hillbilly. But that got beaten out of me during the year that I was there. Anyway,
Wow.
that's how I got interested in all of this, and I've never looked back.
Yeah, wow. You just kind of like stumbled upon it and it was just so many things serendipitously just wow.
Yeah, sometimes you get lucky.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that.
You bet.
So I guess we could kind of now like pivot into like a lot of the work you've done. You mentioned Nagarjuna, um, and I feel like I want to talk about the self. I want to kind of start like with this idea of understanding ourself because this is something you've written much about, and I guess why is that idea specifically important to you? Understanding, trying to understand the self better and um, get to know yourself better. What has that been for you?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it from this, I guess it's multiple answers to that. So here's one answer, kind of like way back in the background. Um, I came to philosophy kind of by accident and good luck too. When I went to college, I went to Oberlin College in the 1970s. Um, I knew what I wanted to do, and that was I wanted to study psychology and
Mm-hmm.
go into clinical psychology. And Oberlin then had what I considered a very oppressive rule, and that was of the 5 courses that you took in each semester. In your first semester, you hear how oppressive this is. You can't take all 5 in the same department. And I thought that was terrible because I wanted to take 5 psych courses because that's what I cared about.
Mm-hmm.
So I signed up for 4 psych courses, and then I couldn't find anything else in the whole catalog that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, they had paper catalogs, not online. So um, I did what like lots of students have done before me. I said, okay, I'm just going to close my eyes. I'm going to open the catalog. First course my finger falls on that fits in my schedule with these 4 courses, I'm going to take it. So I did that, and it was a philosophy course. And I thought, oh God, this looks so boring. It looks so stupid. But I promised myself I would
No
do
way.
this. And maybe what I could do is like after a week, drop it and then add a psychology course and nobody will notice. Right? So I took this course called Philosophy and Values, and it was so interesting. And then we hit David Hume. And when we hit Hume, and it was actually Hume's discussion of personal identity,
Mm-hmm.
I looked at that and I said, wow, if philosophy can do this, I want to do philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really falling in love with David Hume's work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a lifelong obsession. 2 of my recent books are basically about Hume.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that led me to philosophy. And of course, one of the things that Hume points out in the treatise is that as human beings, we generally have a completely illusory view of the kind of thing that we are. We think that we are selves, that we've got substantial cores, but in fact, all we are continua of psychophysical processes connected by causal relations of similarity and social, and have irreducibly social dimensions. And I thought that was brilliant.
And was
And
this your first time? Um, was this your first time engaging with an idea like that? That like
yeah,
you
yeah,
aren't what you think
absolutely.
you. So was it really weird? Were you like, what the hell is this?
It blew my mind, right? I mean, I thought,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, I know what I am. And we
Yeah.
were set up for it because, like in this course, the first thing we read was Descartes' Meditations. And Descartes just kind of reaffirms what you always thought. Yes, you're a self.
Mhm.
Yes, you know who you are. Yes,
Yeah.
you have immediate knowledge of your own mind.
Mhm.
And that was like, okay, yeah, I get it. I get it. Everybody knows this shit. Why do you have to read Descartes to learn this, right?
Yeah.
But then I hit Hume, and he just blew me out of the water, saying, no, none of that's true. You don't have direct knowledge of who you are or what you are. You've got to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
You're socially constructed. You're constantly changing. There is no core self. And yes, it blew me away. And that's why I said, if philosophy can do this, completely dislodge everything I thought about what I was, that's what I want to do with my life.
Yeah.
Um, so I did philosophy and psychology and then went to graduate school in philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there was Hume in the background. And then when I hit Buddhist philosophy, the similarities in the discussion about selflessness and the
Mm-hmm.
illusion of the self are very powerful. But now it acquires a kind of different dimension because it acquires a really explicitly ethical dimension.
Yeah.
Because one of the dimensions that we find in Buddhist philosophy, and I think now in retrospect is implicit in Hume. And in my book on the concealed influence of custom, I argue that there's really the ethics is really at the center stage in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, wasn't obvious to me before, and that's the idea that the grasping to the self is the root not only of confusion about who we are, but the roots of egoism, and so the roots of attraction and aversion, and so the roots of suffering. And
Mm-hmm.
so, kind of like everything that we screw up in the world, we screw up in large part because of an attachment to this mythical thing called a self.
Yeah.
Um, and so, it's because of that diagnosis that Buddhism has, right? If you think about the Four Noble Truths, the first truth is that the world is characterized by suffering. But the
Mm-hmm.
second truth is that the origin of that suffering is in attraction and aversion that in turn are grounded in primal confusion about the nature of reality. And the
Mm-hmm.
first and most immediate aspect of that primal confusion is confusion about who we are and what we are.
Mm-hmm.
And Nagarjuna is working on that. Chandrakirti is working on that. All these guys I like to read and
Mm-hmm.
translate and think about, they're all doing that. So that's why it's so important to me. I think that dislodging that illusion can help us to become better people.
Yeah. Something I've thought about often is as I've studied these ideas myself, it almost seems like because I don't think a lot of people, like I don't think the common person, especially that doesn't read philosophy, I don't think they really think about it that deep, trying to dissect who they are. Um, but I wonder, I've always kind of been curious about if there's something subconscious, like a worry that we don't really know um, what exactly we are. And so I found a lot of comfort in these ideas of dissecting myself and really trying to get to the pinpoint of, I mean, what the hell exactly am I? Because clearly I'm not this. I'm not. One argument I really like that I refer to all the time is Chandrakirti's. Is it the seven way the where he uses a
Sevenfold
chariot,
analysis.
sevenfold
Yeah.
analysis? Yeah, I really love that argument um, because you can't see it doesn't make sense that there would be some self existing within all of that. So, what would you say? What would you say the self is precisely? Um, what would you, yeah, like how would you put it if you were to like,
I would
just,
I would
yeah,
I would with Chandrakirti distinguish carefully between the self and the person.
yeah,
So if you look at my book called Losing Ourselves, How to Be a Person Without a Self, the
yes,
central distinction in that book is the distinction between a person and a self.
yeah,
Um, the self is the target of the destructive analysis, what in Tibetan is called the object of negation. The thing you're trying to show does not exist. Um, so that thing that doesn't exist is that permanent, unchanging, substantial core that is the subject of our experience, the agent that acts on the world, the thing that is distinct from our physical and mental processes, but has those processes as its
mm-hmm,
properties. And that's the thing that we atavistically and instinctively think that we are, but we're not.
mm-hmm, yeah,
That's the illusion is to see what is in fact a person as a self. A person, on the other hand, and here Hume and the Buddhists agree, a person is just a constantly evolving, causally connected continuum of psychophysical processes in
yes,
open interaction with the rest of the world. Um, now, And the nice thing about the word person, is that the word person's got a nice etymology that helps us to understand this. I'm kind of a word freak, and I kind of like this stuff.
I love
The
it.
word person comes from the Latin word persona, and the word persona refers derivatively to a role in a play or in theater. So when you read a play and it says dramatis personae, those are the characters in the play, not the actors, but the characters.
Mm-hmm.
So Julius Caesar is part of the dramatis personae of the play Julius Caesar. But if, you know, you, Antonio, are playing Caesar, you're just an actor playing Caesar. You're not actually Caesar, by the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not a Roman emperor. You're pretending to be a Roman emperor.
Yeah.
But the real origin of the word before that is it refers to the masks. Persona means mask. Per means through. Sona means sound or speak, right? So the mask is what an actor speaks through. So the person is the mask we wear or the role that we have in society.
Yes.
And the important thing to see is that what we are persons. We're defined by our roles, being sons or daughters, being parents, being brothers or sisters, being citizens of a country, being teachers or being students, being candlestick makers or bakers. Those are the roles that we have. And those are often changing as we age. Those are changing as we learn new things. We're defined by our friends. We're defined by our relationships. We're defined by our political views. And all of those things are simply aspects of our constantly evolving, open, causal, and very porous interaction with the world. That's
Mm-hmm.
what we are. There's no core there, just like there's no core to the chariot.
Yeah. Can you talk about the ethical implications of adopting the personhood view over the self view, that
Yeah.
you are some intrinsic self that is separate from everyone else?
Yeah. Um, Let me do it first quick and then get a more detailed picture.
Okay.
The quick, the quick picture is this. When you think of yourself as a self, you think of yourself as the subject of your experience and everything else is the object. It's actually a little bit worse than that because you think of yourself as somebody who's a spectator of the world and who
Mm-hmm.
acts on the world, but isn't in the world, which is a way of showing how screwy it is, right? Because who
Mm-hmm.
honestly believes that they're not in the world?
Yeah.
But the kind of experience is there's the world out there, and I'm in here experiencing it and acting on it. When you do that, then the difference in status between you and everyone else is marked. You're the subject and the agent. Everybody else is object and patient. And that means that it makes sense, really, only to care about one individual in the world, the important one. That's me, because I'm the subject, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we see this enshrined in modern microeconomic theory. So if anybody's taken economics, the definition of a rational actor, of somebody, an agent in the marketplace who's functioning, is somebody who disinterestedly tries to maximize their own welfare. Where disinterested means they don't care about the welfare of others. So I'm not trying to make you worse off. I'm also not trying to make you better off, because as far as I'm concerned, Antonio, you don't matter. What matters is my welfare. Now, if it makes me smile and makes me happy to see you doing well, then yeah, I'll make you do well. But I'm making you do well because it makes me happy, not because it makes you happy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or if I think it would be fun to torture you for a while, then yeah, I'll torture you because that would make me happy. And yeah, it's not so good for you, but like I say, your welfare is not important in this calculus. So when you look at economic theory, it treats a marketplace as a bunch of individual rational actors, each seeking to maximize their own welfare and not caring about anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to say that that's not just plain evil, it's stupid. Because human beings are not individuals who arbitrarily come together in collectives and meet one another. It's not like we're roaming around the wilderness as solo individuals, like, say, Siberian tigers, and every so often at mating season we encounter somebody else. We're social animals like bees. And all of what makes us happy or unhappy are social things. So the idea that you could care about your own welfare, but not anybody else's, is just dumb. All right, that's part of what goes wrong, right? So when you think of yourself as a self, it encourages that view of rationality and that view of what a good life looks like. A good life then looks like a life where I get all the toys that I want. End of story. That's a stupid model of a good life. You get a lot of toys and then you die. Anyway, a deeper way of thinking about that is that the egocentricity that is built into the view of the self makes it impossible to develop the virtues that we really think human beings ought to develop, that make us happy and that make those around us happier. A nice catalog of those is the one that we find in Buddhism of the so-called Brahma Viharas, or divine states. And those are friendliness, metta or maitri, care, sometimes badly translated compassion, that's karuna, impartiality or equanimity, upeksha. And the fourth one is the one that's kind of hardest to kind of say in English. We generally call it sympathetic joy, mudita, which means the ability to take pleasure in other people's happiness and success. Kind of the opposite of schadenfreude. It's kind of funny that English thought it was necessary to bring schadenfreude into our vocabulary to describe an emotion we all enjoy, but we didn't bring mudita in, which is a much more important one. Now, to continue this story and to give more detail, the great Theravada Buddhist commentator, Buddhaghosa, who lived in about the 5th century, in his beautiful discussion of the Brahma Viharas, points out that each one has both what he calls a far enemy and a near enemy. The far enemy is kind of the antonym for the Brahma Vihara. So the far enemy of maitri or friendliness is cruelty, or the far enemy of mudita is schadenfreude, or the far enemy of karuna is cruelty, right? So, you've got all of these possible far enemies, the absolute opposites. But he pointed out for each one of these, there's also a near enemy. And the near enemy is much more dangerous because the near enemy masquerades as the virtue and is easy to confuse with the virtue. Now, I want to give you an idea of the structure so we can see how the self is involved here. Mm-hmm. So the near enemy of friendliness is partiality or nepotism. So somebody said, oh, Jay's a really good friend to have, because if you're Jay's friend, he's going to help you get a job, or he's going to help you, get your book published or something like that. That makes Jay a really good friend. I do stuff for the people I know, and I make sure people I don't know don't get the jobs and don't get the books published, right? That's partiality or nepotism. It feels good, right? I think, look at all these people I've helped, and everybody who I've helped likes me. So it feels like a good thing, but it's actually a vice. Or if we take karuna, the near enemy, I won't do all 4 of them, I promise, is sloppy sympathy. And I'll give you a really nice real life example of this. A few years ago, my darling wife came off a horse the wrong way and broke the bones in her wrist. And so we had to go to an urgent care center. And we go to the urgent care center and they did the x-ray, and this very nice nurse said, look, I'm going to have to reset these bones and it's going to hurt like hell, but I have to do it because otherwise the wrist won't heal properly. So he reset the bones and she screamed and it did hurt like hell. And about 2 minutes later, another nurse came into the room and she said, oh, I'm so sorry. She was crying. She said, oh, I'm so sorry. I really wanted to be here to help, but I'm such a compassionate, caring person that I can't stand to see somebody in pain. So I couldn't come in until that was done. The first nurse is the one who has karuna, who actually cares enough to do something. The second one thinks that she's such a wonderful person because she can't do her job. But what she's got is sloppy sympathy that doesn't enable her to care for her patients. It
Mm-hmm.
feels really good to her because she feels, oh, I'm such a nice person, I can't stand pain. And what it does is it impairs her morally. Now, in each of these cases, Buddhaghosa's diagnosis is the same. The near enemy is a vice because it puts my own feelings and interests at center stage. Either how much I like my friends and so do good things for them in the case of friendliness or nepotism, or how hard it is for me to stand your pain when I'm doing the karuna instead of caring enough about your pain to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so the point that Buddhaghosa is making is that what prevents us from developing morally is that illusion of self that puts my own feelings first in my decisions. And what enables me to develop morally is setting that illusion of self aside and just focusing on well-being and suffering. And that makes a huge difference. So the self-illusion isn't innocuous. It's not like, optical illusions that we know we're wired for that, you can play parlor games with. But it actually undermines us ethically. And so I think that it's really important to get clear about what we are and to understand that what we are interdependent persons, not independent selves.
Yeah. Yeah, I love Buddhaghosa and the Brahmi Viharas, excuse me. Um, I feel like it's done so much for me. It's helped me just find more peace in my life, as well as understand how I can engage with this existence and others in a way that is of service in just the best way that I can. It's just I just think it's some of the most beautiful philosophy on ethics. Um, yeah, I really love your explanation. I kind of want to lean into another topic. Sorry, this is a crazy pivot from what we're talking about right now. But I want to explore the idea of emptiness
Mm-hmm.
and sort of. I'm really curious for an explanation from you and how you would go about what I'm about to ask. But when I first stumbled upon Nagarjuna's doctrine of emptiness, it was one of the most beautiful but terrifying things I'd ever found myself reading. It was very unsettling but beautiful and one of the most peaceful things ever at the same time. It was such a contradiction. Um, and I feel like now I've found peace in it. The better I've been able to understand that he's saying that nothing. It's not that nothing exists. It's just that things don't exist the way you thought they did, which was they have like this intrinsic existence. So my question, where I'm kind of going with this whole question, is um, with the whole doctrine that is emptiness. Why should it not be taken as nihilistic, and why is that a liberating philosophy to consider?
Not as big a pivot as you think, of course, because what we've been talking about so far is the emptiness of a person, the
Mm-hmm.
fact that persons are empty of selves. And I want to just lean into that a bit before making the bigger point.
Okay.
When we say that persons are empty of selves, we're not saying that persons don't exist.
Right.
We're saying they don't exist in the way we ordinarily take them to exist as
Mm-hmm.
selves. Rather, they exist as interdependent persons. Um, and so, what that reminds us is that whenever we say that something is empty, we have to ask the question, empty of what? Um, so if somebody is hunting elephants and they come into my house and they look around, they say, oh, this place is empty. There's no elephants. But there are people there and there are dogs there. Um, and so, you might say, oh, it's not empty, there's stuff here. Well, suppose that we go out for the afternoon and my wife and I and the two dogs go down to the beach. Somebody comes in and says, nobody's home, the house is empty, let's rip it off. they're saying it's empty of people, but it's not empty of stuff because there's stuff they want to carry out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, suppose they carried all our stuff out and call the police, and the police come and say, wow, this place is really empty. The physicist says, no, it's not empty. There's plenty of air in there, and so forth. So you have to always ask, empty of what?
Mm-hmm.
And as you pointed out in your framing of the question, when we say empty in a Madhyamaka analysis, in Nagarjuna's analysis, we mean empty of intrinsic nature, not empty of existence. Now, I used this phrase earlier, and I'm going to come back to it. Tsongkhapa, this great Tibetan philosopher, introduces this term in Tibetan that we translate into English as the object of negation. And he says, before you begin any analysis that's meant to show that something isn't real in some way, you've got to first ascertain what the object of negation is, so that you're sure that you don't confuse it with something else. This actually comes from an example of Chandrakirti's. It comes from, an example in his context of talking about the emptiness of the person. Chandrakirti tells the story of somebody who's worried that he has a snake living in the wall of his house. And he wants to get rid of that worry. So he looks around and says, no elephants here, I can relax. And Chandrakirti says, what an idiot that is. Because what you've done is you've chosen the wrong object of negation to eliminate. You've got to eliminate the snake, not the elephant. So similarly, Tsongkhapa emphasizes that when we engage in Madhyamaka analysis, the object of negation is intrinsic existence, not existence per se. So what we're doing is arguing that a kind of existence that we reflexively, habitually, instinctively assign to things is illusory, but instead they have a different kind of existence, which is a just fine kind of existence. An example that I like to use, and I'll come back to what that is in a moment. I'm not forgetting. I'll give an example though. An example that I like to use a lot in explaining emptiness to people is money. Because everybody, when they've got a little money in their pocket, feels like they've got something pretty valuable. Like suppose you've got a $5 note in your pocket and you've got a $1 note in your pocket. You got a lot of money. You got $6. You can almost buy a cup of coffee. So you look at that and you think, well, one of these is worth 5 times as much as the other one. Now ask yourself, what is it about that paper and ink that's in your left hand that makes it worth 5 times as much as the paper and ink in your right hand? Mm-hmm. Call your chemists, call the analysts in. Nobody's going to find anything there. They're empty of any intrinsic value. There's nothing about paper and green ink that makes it worth this much versus that much. Instead, the existence of the $5 is absolutely dependent on things like the Federal Reserve, if you're in the United States, or the Reserve Bank of Australia, if you're in Australia, where it's not going to be green ink on white paper, but that's a different question. But it's going to be dependent on the banking system. It's going to be dependent on having an economy where people accept the currency for things. If people simply stopped accepting $5 notes and $1 notes, they would become worthless. It wouldn't be that people had looked at the paper, analyzed it, and decided that they were worthless. They would become worthless because people stopped treating them as though they were worth something. Now, what that means is, does that mean that when you've got $6 in your pocket, you actually have nothing? No, it means you have $6, but it means you have something whose value consists entirely in extrinsic factors, in sets of conventions, in ways that those pieces of paper can be used, and in political and economic decisions that people make. That's it. Beyond that, it's not as though, imagine somebody said, wow, isn't it great that somebody discovered money and found all of these pieces of paper lying around and then figured out how to use them. That would be to think that money existed intrinsically and we just found it. Instead, you want to say, we bring it into existence in virtue of our conventions. Mm-hmm. That's what Madhyamaka analysis is saying is the analogy for everything. Yes. It doesn't exist, things do not exist intrinsically as the kinds of things they are. They become the kinds of things they are through our conventions of individuation, through causes and conditions, through practices, through all of that stuff. So that the identity conditions of persons are social. The identity conditions of tables are social. The identity conditions of electrons are theoretical, and so forth. None of those things has intrinsic identity. The identity is always a relational identity. So what they're empty of is that kind of intrinsic identity. Now, when we think about, to come back now to answer your question, you said, why is that not nihilism? Nihilism is one of two extremes. The other extreme is reification. When we reify something, we treat it as realer than it is. And for most human beings, the sin to which we are most liable is reification, treating ourselves as realer than we are, treating things as realer than they are. To treat something nihilistically is to deny the reality that it does have. Now, if we denied that things existed at all, that would be nihilistic. But to deny that they have intrinsic reality is not nihilistic, because we're denying that they have something that they in fact don't have. To impute intrinsic reality would be to reify them, because we would be imputing something that they don't have. Yeah. That's the important point. So the extremes of nihilism and realism arise from a misconception of what it is to exist. If you think that to exist is to exist intrinsically, then you've opened the door to both extremes. You've opened the door to the extreme of reification, because having seen that things exist, you decide that they exist intrinsically. You've opened the door to nihilism, because you've said, because of the moment you discover that they don't exist intrinsically, you think that they don't exist at all. But if you can see that to exist is to exist conventionally, through the analogy of the $5 note, then you can see that things neither exist intrinsically nor fail to exist at all. In fact, they exist conventionally. Yeah. Does that help?
Yes, it was. Thank you. It's like I remember when I saw this quote that Nagarjuna said something about grabbing the snake by the wrong end, and if you don't understand precisely what he's saying, then it will be a sort of nihilistic view, and it can be daunting if you just adopt the view that nothing exists.
That's right.
I'm curious, for you personally, how have these your relationship to these ideas, emptiness, existing as a person, how have you been able to better see, I guess, see more clearly through that illusion? I know there's a lot of there's contemplative practice, there's meditation, there's types of different things that we can do. I'm just curious for you, like what helps you, of course, doing philosophy, but is there anything that's helped you like get to like really experience and feel the, or I guess, increase your understanding and experience in these ideas?
It's two things. One, it's thinking these things through philosophically and thinking them through again and again and again, and catching myself whenever I'm suddenly aware that I'm screwing it up, and saying, okay, what am I doing to screw this up? And directing attention to that illusion, directing attention to the screw up. The screw ups are more common than the getting it right.
Oh yeah.
And if you pay attention to when you screw up, you spend a lot of time paying attention, because we instinctively reify. We instinctively posit a self. We instinctively see our relation to the world dualistically as self and object. And so constantly catching yourself in those instinctive habits and then doing the analysis. The Tibetan term for meditation is a lovely term, it's gom, which means to become familiar, to familiarize yourself. And the idea is that what we do in our practice is that we take these ideas that are unfamiliar to us when we first read them and sound a little bit challenging and scary, and we make them so familiar that they're the way that we see the world. It's kind of like cultural adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
um, or learning a language. If you've ever studied a language other than your own, you know that at first you have to think hard about every word and think hard about the syntax of the sentences you're uttering and try to figure out what somebody's saying to you by parsing the sentence. Then there comes this wonderful moment when you realize that you're just speaking and listening, when you've become so familiar that it becomes part of the way that you see the world. And then when you learn that language, because languages see the world slightly differently from one another, you start suddenly seeing the world differently. And I think that as we learn the language of Madhyamaka, the language of Yogacara, the language of Theravada, then we come both to become more familiar with those ideas. And that loosens up some of these ingrained habits and allows us to see the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires attention.
Yeah.
It requires constantly catching yourself.
Mm-hmm. Constantly, yeah. For me, at least, it's all the time.
One of the best teachings I ever heard in my life from a Tibetan teacher um, was from Kamto Rinpoche. And this was in Bodh Gaya. I used to run an exchange program for over 30 years where I would take students to India to study Buddhist philosophy. And I would go and teach Western philosophy, and we'd bring Tibetan students over to America and Australia and bring Tibetan teachers over. Anyway, I had a group of American and Australian students in Bodh Gaya, and I got a text message from Kamto Rinpoche's attendant, who was a friend of mine. He said, Rinpoche's here in Bodh Gaya, and he'd be willing to see you and give your students an audience. So, oh, that's really a good idea. It would be really nice for my students to have the cultural experience of an audience with a high Tibetan Lama and to, understand what those rituals look like and all that. I figured that he would give them a blessing. They would offer katas, and, that would be really cool, and they would have something to take away. But anyway, we got there, and he said, so I'd like to teach you something. I want to teach you about the Eightfold Path. And so he began with seven parts of the path, right? So he started, as one always does, with right view and talked about that, and right speech and right action and right livelihood and all of that. And he left out right mindfulness, right attention. And then he got to the end and he said, so all these seven that I've just taught you, I want you to practice them all right now for 1 second. See, you did it. You didn't do any wrong action. You didn't do any wrong speech. You didn't engage in any wrong livelihood. He said, now do it one more moment. See, that was easy. He said, now, if you have right mindfulness, you can just keep doing that moment after moment after moment. But if you don't, the third moment, you're going to lose it. And I thought that was a very, very nice teaching of why mindfulness is so important.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Have you, well, let me phrase it this way. Do you think there's, I'm kind of playing with the mysticism right now. Is there a state that human beings can reach when they are, I think nirvana means to blow the smoke out or something like that, to see.
Yeah, blowing a candle out, blowing a fire out.
Blowing a fire out, yeah. To see more, once you reach that place of seeing more clearly. What are your thoughts on that state? Do you, is it mystical? Is it, does it require rigorous asceticism?
It may require rigorous asceticism to achieve. I don't know. I can't speak to that one. But I don't think it's mystical. Nirvana is a negation. And it's a negation of the fire of suffering.
Yeah.
So there's a wonderful sutta called the Fire Sutta, the Pali Canon. Very short sutta, easy to memorize, where the Buddha says, monks, the entire world is on fire. Your physical form is on fire. Sensations are on fire. Perceptions are on fire. Personality traits are on fire. Consciousness is on fire. Nirvana is the cooling of that fire. And then you realize that these fire metaphors that are in Buddhism are really important because he's picked up all of the khandhas, right? And what the psychophysical clusters are aggregates. But the root of the Pali term for that, for the aggregates, is the pile of wood that you would put on a corpse to burn for on a funeral pyre. That's what skandha means. Um, and so that metaphor, when we say that the human being is composed of these five aggregates or heaps or piles or skandhas or whatever, the metaphor, if you're in India, is it's on fire. It's firewood. That's what we're composed of. And so our life is spent burning. And the suffering and the burning is caused by wanting things we don't have and not having things that we do have. And that's caused by confusion about who we are and what the world is like. Now, the third truth is that if you can get rid of that confusion, you get rid of the attraction and the aversion, and the fires go out. I think that makes total sense, that given that we manage to lead our lives as though we're on fire most of the time, and given that that's just not, you know, a random occurrence, but something that we actually bring about through our own misperception of reality, then if we can come to perceive reality better, we can cool those flames a bit.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense.
It's so interesting because I agree with you. It doesn't seem so mystical. Um, it sounds mystical, but
And it gets
it
mystified in a lot of traditions, but
yeah,
I don't think it needs
true.
to be. I think
Hmm.
that Buddhism is eminently psychological, phenomenological, practical.
Yeah.
It's about transitioning from an idea, um, transitioning from a state of egocentricity and suffering, where egocentricity feels good, but in fact forces you to suffer, into a state where you get rid of that egocentricity and can live more happily.
Hmm.
Shantideva has a beautiful verse in Bodhicharyavatara in the eighth chapter, where he says, all of the unhappiness in the world, all the suffering in the world comes from people seeking their own happiness. All of the happiness in the world comes from people seeking the happiness of others. And that's a very nice point about egocentricity.
Yeah.
And so I think the way that we want to understand nirvana is like coming to really recognize it's not all about me,
Hmm.
and being able to take genuine pleasure in the happiness of others. Not because I like them, but because they're happy.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely love that. Do you personally engage in any contemplative practice or meditation?
My principal contemplative practice is studying and thinking and doing philosophy and writing and teaching.
Yeah,
I'm not a good meditator.
me neither. I try, but I'm not good either. Um, what about these ideas? I've read this in Buddhist text. Buddhaghosa, I believe, talked about these supernatural powers
Yeah.
and these sort of ideas that come from reaching these higher states of, or I think he would put it as you advance in your meditation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what are your thoughts on those sort of mystical ideas?
Yeah, I don't have much time for supernatural powers. I do think that as people become more adept at meditative and contemplative practices, they may
Yeah.
come to understand things, see things more deeply, and develop much more subtle perceptions of their own states and the states of others. And
Mm-hmm.
that's developing moral perceptual expertise, which I think
Yes.
is what Buddhism is all about. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't think any of that's supernatural. I think that's just the development of particular kinds of expertise.
Mm. So it's just a um, sensitivity that you gain by understanding human nature better and understand yourself better. You can better see these patterns essentially.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Um, can we talk about the idea of reincarnation and
we can.
past lives and those? I don't have a deep understanding in these ideas, but I find them I find them very interesting. I know many people mention that they've experienced past lives through meditation or psychedelics. I mean, that's a whole completely different topic. Um, I'm just curious, what's your personal take on reincarnation and the whole idea of past lives?
Okay, so let's couple of distinctions first.
Yeah.
Get the analytic tools on the table. First is we've got to draw a distinction between rebirth and reincarnation.
Hmm.
People often use those terms interchangeably. They're subtly and importantly different. Reincarnation has its home in the Orthodox Indian schools. And that's the idea of having a single thing, an Atman or a self, that gets a new body in different lives. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna, it's just like this, just as when you take your dirty clothes off at night and put clean clothes on in the morning, your self takes a dirty body off when you die and puts a clean body on when you get born.
Mm.
That's not a Buddhist idea, right?
Hmm.
But Buddhism did develop in an Indian milieu in which that idea of reincarnation or rebirth was really important, and subtly shifts it because it has to be understood in the context of no self. If you've got no self, you've got no thing that's putting on a new body. Instead, Indian Buddhists and Tibetan Buddhists thought about rebirth as the continuing of the causal continuum that is a person past the physical death of the body and into a new birth. Not as a self doing that, but rather as the continuation, in this case, not so much the physical, but of the psychological states
Hmm.
into a new birth. Now, first thing to say, that is a very important cultural belief in India and in Tibet. It may also have always been somewhat metaphorical as well, because it's bound up with the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of existence in the six realms. So we've got human realms, sort of superhero realms, the god, divinity realms,
Hmm.
animal realm, Preta realm, or hungry ghosts, and hell realms, right? So you think of transmigration and taking rebirth in these different realms. Those have always had um, a psychological understanding as well as a cosmological understanding. So we can think of the way that we constantly cycle between moods or attitudes that place us in each of those realms, and understand the Bhava Chakra as a model for human psychology, as well as a model for rebirth. When Buddhism went to China, sort of the first or second big transmission of Buddhism out of India, um, it moved into a country where people had absolutely no appetite for rebirth. Um, Chinese wanted their ancestors dead and stayed dead so that they could be propitiated. So when Buddhism moved into China, rebirth sort of dropped out of the Buddhism of China as anything very interesting. It was just in there as a kind of fable or a metaphor, but never taken seriously. And we find that through the East Asian context. When Buddhism has come to the West in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, we've had two streams, well, many streams, but two big streams of Buddhist transmission. So we've had a stream from South Asia and Southeast Asia, and we've had a stream from East Asia. From the South and Southeast Asian, so it's the Tibetan and the Thai and Burmese and Indian side, we've had a strong belief in rebirth. From the Chinese, Korean, Japanese side, it's also a transmission. We've had a
Hmm.
Buddhism where rebirth plays very little role. And Western people have had a vexed time trying to figure out what to do with all of this, because we're not a culture that's a big rebirth culture. We're a culture that's a you die and go to heaven or hell culture,
Yeah.
which is real different, right?
Yeah.
Much more like the Chinese culture. Um, so there's a question about what to do with all of that. Now, that's the first big set of distinctions. The other set of distinctions is the distinction between believing in past lives and future lives and believing in my personal past lives and future lives. I think you'd have to be really stupid not to believe that there were past lives. your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, the people who lived in the 18th century, the people who lived in the 14th century, those are past lives, right? And you better believe they're past lives. And unless we screw the planet up really badly in the next few weeks, there's going to be some future lives. So believing in past lives and future lives is kind of non-negotiable. The question for negotiation is, what's my personal relationship to particular past lives and future lives? Okay. Now, the reason that it's important to take seriously past lives and future lives is in order to make sense of karma. And karma, the word karma just means action, but it also has the secondary meaning as a contraction of karma phala, which means the effects of action. So we can think of karma either as meaning actions or its effects. When we think of the karmic system, we're talking about the fact that actions have effects. And Buddhists have pointed out, I think quite correctly, that our actions have effects for future lives. And that the actions and the things that we experience now are the effects of past lives. And again, I think that's all kind of non-negotiable. If you don't think that the world you inhabit now was in part caused by the things people did in the past, the wars they fought, the inventions they made, the institutions they constructed, the laws they enacted, then you're out of your mind. And if you think that what you do now isn't going to affect the future, you're out of your mind. So again, I think karma is completely non-negotiable. Again, the question is that about personal stuff, right? So do I have to believe that what I do now, what I experience now, is the effect of what I myself did in a past life? I can't take that seriously. But can I take seriously that I've inherited karma from past lives, collective and individual? Yeah. Do I think that what I do is going to affect future lives? Yeah, that's why I pay attention to politics and ecology and try to do things that are going to make that better. Does it have to be me who lives in the future? No. So I think we can make total sense of karma without personal rebirth. We can make total sense of past lives and future lives without personal rebirth. Even if we accept personal rebirth, we're not accepting reincarnation, accepting something different. My own view is that modern science tells us that the idea of personal rebirth is probably dead false. And I'm not interested in a philosophical or religious doctrine that makes me check my mind at the door. So what do I think about personal rebirth? I think it was something that was important culturally to classical Indians and Tibetans, and that there's no reason why it's got to be culturally important to me. What do I think about what was important about it? Well, one was this idea of being reborn every moment into different realms or ways of existing. Sometimes feeling like an animal and snapping at people and then feeling really guilty about it later. Sometimes feeling like everything's absolutely fabulous, how I often feel here in Tasmania, with gorgeous landscapes and beautiful wines and so forth. I think I'm in a Devaloka and it's never going to end, right? Sometimes for a minute or two, finding myself feeling like a real human being. I think that's an important thing, that's psychology. And I also think that the vision of moral responsibility that extends both to the past and the future is also really important. So it's important for those of us who have inherited the benefits of colonialism, genocide, and slavery to recognize that we've got moral responsibility for that, even if we didn't personally do it, because that's how karma works. If we've inherited the goods that we have because of what was done to enslaved people or because of genocides, we're in receipt of stolen goods, whether we'd like to or not. And that's karma we have to deal with. And also to recognize that what we do doesn't have effects that end when we hit the grave, that it affects those who come after us. That generates a sense of moral responsibility of the future. That, I think, is non-negotiable. But personal rebirth, I think that's up to people to decide what they want to do with it. My own view is science tells me it ain't there.
Yeah, I love what you said in that. Yeah, no, that was super helpful. I want to listen back to that and really try to digest that more. But I totally agree that just even the littlest actions in our day, just the smallest things have the greatest impact. Um, Jade, thank you so much for just joining me. This has been uh, such a special treat. If we just close out with one more question, um, out of like all the philosophy, I mean, this isn't every day I get to talk to someone that has such an expertise in this field. So I'm just curious. Um, I mean, is there something that pops to your mind when I ask the following question? That is, what is one of the most like profound things that you've taken from philosophy? Just what comes to mind?
The fact that most of our experience is profoundly illusory, and that we need an enormous humility about what we think that we know and who we think we are.
I love that. Jay, again, thank you so much.
Thank
This
you,
was really,
Antonio.
yeah, this
It's
was
been
really
a real
special to me.
pleasure. I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much, Jay. To you and your dog for joining me. I really
Oh yes,
appreciate this. This was awesome.
he loves to be on Zoom.
All right. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.